Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to our second day of our 2026 annual Zora Neale Hurston Conference. And I have the pleasure of introducing the person who will be doing the keynote address. Dana A. Williams is Professor of African American Literature in the Department of English and Dean of the Graduate School at Howard University. Dean Williams earned her BA in English from Grambling State University in Grambling, Louisiana in 1993, her MA in 1995 from Howard University, her PhD in African American Literature from Howard University in 1999. As a recipient of the Ford Foundation Postdoctoral Scholar Award, she was a visiting research fellow at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, before returning to Howard as a faculty member in 2003. Dr. Williams taught at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge for 4 years. Excuse me. In 2008 to 2009, she was a faculty fellow, at the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University, and she assumed chairmanship of Howard's Department of English in 2009. Dean Williams was nominated by President Barack Obama in 2016 to serve on the National Humanities Council. In 2019, she was named interim dean of the graduate school, and in 2020, she became the graduate school's first female dean. Pardon. Dr. Williams's most recent book is Toni at Random, the iconic writer's legendary editorship. She is past president of the College Language Association, the oldest and largest professional organization for faculty of color who teach languages and literatures, and has recently been named editor of the association's journal. She's past president of the Modern Languages Association and the Toni Morrison Society, and currently serves on the advisory board for the Hurston Wright Foundation. We want to give you, from wherever you are, everyone, let's give her a wildcat welcome. Excuse me, a wildcat welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that welcome. I'm so glad to be here and so glad to see so many of you whom I recognize in the virtual space. We were joking in the virtual green room that virtual conferences are an opportunity to connect with people and that they begin to feel at home even as you are in the physical space together. So I'm grateful for the opportunity just to be in the space with so many of you. I'm excited also about all the things that have happened with the conference so far and what will continue to happen over the course of the day, because we know the significance not just of Ms. Hurston's legacy, but of course of the very thing that we're talking about today around publishing, editing, and censorship. I'll share a few things with you just as disclaimers of sorts from the top. You'll see some things on the slide that are from the archival collection, and there are limits to the amount that we can share in the public. So they'll come down fairly quickly, and I'll talk through some of the things that I won't project, but that I actually have images of. And I'm happy to like linger a little bit during Q&A. So I'll start with my screen share and just begin to um, talk with you in our time together on a couple of different titles that I'm riffing on. There, her eyes, I have it, we all say it, their eyes. Her eyes were watching their backs. And what that means in the way of publishing, editing, and censorship. Toni Morrison and literary friendships and kinships, and how those really impact the way that we come to know Black women writers in the tradition of Zora Neale Hurston. I want to begin my remarks about Morrison's editorial friendships and the implications of publishing and censorship, talking about Barbara Chase Rabeau, Lucille Clifton, and Toni K. Bombara. But first, I want to nod to Angela Davis. Because Morrison's skill at helping Barbara Chase Rabeau as a poet, but who was a sculptor first, Lucille Clifton, who was a published writer before Morrison became her editor, and Toni K. Bambara, who was all of the remarkable things before Morrison became her editor. That Morrison's skill with helping them publish the kind of book that they wanted to publish was sharpened by what grew to become a lifelong friendship between Angela Davis and Toni Morrison. And here you've seen the iconic image of Morrison. You see the iconic image of Morrison and Davis on the street in New York, first, the larger one, and then the friendship becoming more apparent as you see Davis with Morrison's son, Ford, and then the fact that their friendship persisted. You see, they continued to be in conversation with each other long after they began to work together. For 22 months, while awaiting trial, a gag rule prohibited Angela Davis from speaking publicly. Once she was acquitted, she reluctantly agreed to a press conference immediately following the verdict to thank her supporters and to advocate for the release of all political prisoners. Not long after her release, Davis agreed to go on a speaking tour to encourage all the local committees working on her behalf to continue their work even after she had been released. Without exception, her appearances were met with large crowds and media coverage. Offers for a book contract to tell her story were inevitable, but only one editor would persuade her that she could write the kind of book that really mattered, a book that was as much about a movement as it was about any one person's life. And that editor, of course, was Toni Morrison. Davis's now well-known reluctance to write an autobiography at such a young age was also informed in no small part by her assumption that publishers would try to sensationalize her story. She also talked about the fact that the autobiography was typically and traditionally a male genre. So how could she work within those limits? How could she push back against censorship against women's voices, telling certain kinds of political stories, and against a publishing industry that had recently become more interested in the sensational than anything else? Sadly, she was right. The attempt to sensationalize her story was there, at least until Morrison intervened. And in case you're wondering, like I'm intentionally doing the black screen so as not to be distracted, but I can go back to this one just for a second. And the next one, you'll see another image. Before the deal was finalized, Bernard Geis, the independent publisher who popularized the celebrity memoir, had begun to outline the book. So Geis had begun to work out of a Hollywood model. And as prevalent as we think of celebrity memoirs now, they were not at the time that Angela Davis was thinking about writing the biography. The tell-all was a new genre, if you will, which was not always met with welcome arms because people in Hollywood, had the what stays and happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, what happens in Hollywood stays in Hollywood sentiment. So Geis began to think of ways that he could tell the stories for profit. And that's the independent publisher that ends up getting the initial contract with Angela Davis's legal team to do a book. So imagine her distaste for that kind of book being met with a mainstream publisher to publish the hardback. Bantam would only do paperback, so they needed to partner with a publisher that could do the hardback. And Morrison intervenes at that point, baiting the curiosity of people who were thinking that he could convince Davis's team to write the book that he wanted. This is how Bernard Geis describes the story. Now that George Jackson is dead, only Angela Davis can give a true account of their unique and tender love story. Through the concrete of Soledad Prison before Angela was indicted, in their letters and in their encounter in jail, and later across the distance between their separate cells in two separate prisons, a profoundly fulfilling relationship developed between them. Now, imagine you're Angela Davis and this is how your life story is being narrated. That's the synopsis that Bernard Geis is putting out publicly about what Angela Davis's autobiography would be. Juxtapose that against what it actually is. And I would argue that the difference is Morrison. So this is set up immediately as now that George Jackson is dead, only Angela Davis can tell the account of their true and tender love story. Still tentative about her willingness to write an autobiography instead of a nonfiction book, Davis agreed to meet with Morrison, in part to express her reservations about the ways the genre could not do the work that she wanted to do with a book. And of course, she was an academic, so she had written before, so she was willing to do something nonfiction, but not an autobiography. Morrison convinced her that the autobiography could be and could do whatever she wanted it to be and whatever she wanted it to do. Once a solid draft of Davis's manuscript was complete, Morrison sent a copy to Bantam in keeping with their contract for joint publication. After reading the report, Morrison fired off a 4-page response. Quote, I have found the requirement of Angela to meet somebody else's need, be it personal, sexual, political, or whatever, to be overwhelming. The fantasy moves between two poles. One is, give me some of what you have. The other is, come on. Now, aren't you really a sweet, charming girl? End quote. When the reviewer repeatedly called for more of Davis's humanness in the draft, Morrison responded, humanness is a word, quote, white people use when they want to alter an uppity or fearless nigger, end quote. Nothing about Morrison's matter-of-fact tone suggested that this was the first nonfiction book that she had edited, when really it was. The fact that she had been successful in her determination and that the book sold well emboldened her in two ways. Among writers edited that she edited, she could find friends, and among friends, she could be herself. Over the years, the two women remained close and they had little reason to separate business and friendship. In the first paragraph of a letter about Davis's second book, Morrison was all business. Quote, let me know as soon as you have gotten in touch with Bernie Geis. We cannot draw up contract terms until something one way or another is resolved. If there are going to be changes in personnel, then I need to know what those changes are. Call me collect, end quote. Just a quick little note about that. So the initial contract is for a 2-book deal. So as Angela Davis is trying to figure out what to do with the next book, she still has to work with Bernie Geis. And it's actually working fine now because Morrison has put Geis in check to some degree. The second paragraph, however, no longer about business, all friendship. Here's what Morrison writes, quote, also, Toni K. Bombara says you're doing Atlanta in December. If so, I'd like very much for you to get in touch with her. You will get on splendidly, and her house will be a good home for you. She says to tell you she has a popcorn popper. I was telling her about the benefits of popcorn as well as your and Fanny's method of popping it. Love and stuff is how Morrison signed off. Unquote. When Morrison and Bombara first met, or met for the first time, we see their relationship begin to grow. And as you can see, there is the expansion of that friendship into others. Here's that image of the Bantam report that Morrison gives us some context for to begin to think about how she is able to respond over the course of those 4 pages to the report that wants Angela Davis to be more human. What she says before she moves on from the business is, I find the Bantam report wholly useless. I'm prepared to cut the manuscript 200 pages and to deal with style and to introduce some of the risk and the joy in her life. But if that's not sufficient, then you may as well reject this manuscript completely. Morrison took that same kind of fearlessness into her business activity with all of her writers, but especially with those with whom she would become friends. When Morrison and Toni K. Bombara first met again in Morrison's office at Random House, both women were fascinated by the fact that they had not met before. They had so many friends in common. They had frequented so many of the same places. How could they have possibly missed each other? What they said was, never mind about that. They were together now. And here you see images of Toni K. Bombara, and then below, images of Morrison with Bombara, along with here Quincy Troop, then Gloria Baldwin, Morrison, Toni K. Bombara, Ishmael Reed, and then Chinwe-Su. And it's actually through Quincy Troop that Morrison and Bombara began to establish a stronger relationship. The two Tonys, as Toni K. Bombara's mother referred to them, had a gossip, their mutual acquaintance, to thank for their initial introduction, even as it is Troop who helps them to cement their friendship. Bombara and Gossett had been friends for years. The two had hung out together at a gathering spot, Pee Wee's on Avenue A between 12th and 13th Streets in New York. And Gossett had been an editor for theater magazines, but had never been a book agent. Morrison was fascinated even with the prospect of buying a book from a Black woman agent because there were so few. And then it was all the more daring because Gossett was not actually an agent and had not done it before. The three of them together schemed to secure a contract for the book that would become Gorilla My Love. Even before meeting Bambara in her office, Bambara and Morrison had shared a determination to put an end to the myth that books by and about Black people could not sell well nationally. So, to your right, you see the image of Toni Cade Bambara's, and it's listed here. She's Toni Cade before she takes the name Bambara um, as the editor of The Black Woman. That book had already made the point that books by Black women could indeed sell well. Bambara and Morrison also shared a healthy skepticism of a particular kind or brand of feminism. The Black woman was not a feminist manifesto Bambara found herself repeating to everyone. Instead, it offered a three-dimensional approach to the major issues it addressed. Its significance rested perhaps in its unwillingness to embrace or to advance the male-female dichotomies that we saw in white women's brands of feminism. Bambara saw no dilemma in intersectionality long before it becomes a term. Here's what Bambara says about it. Quote, "It's not as if you're a Black or a woman. I don't find that basic contradiction or any tension between being a feminist, being a Pan-Africanist, being a Black nationalist, being an internationalist, being a socialist, and being a woman in North America. No distinction. I'm not sensitive enough to people caught up in that contradiction to be able to unravel their dilemma. My head is somewhere else altogether," end quote. Her head and her work, much like her friends, were committed to finding language that could give voice to the full range of Black humanity. The first book that Morrison edited with Bambara was Gorilla My Love, a collection of short stories. Other editors at Random House had writers and critics that they could rely on for endorsements. Morrison did not, as a new person in the industry. Gorilla My Love was, in fact, her first, or Bambara, for Bambara, Gorilla My Love was her first literary book where she was the single author. She had worked as an editor and as of anthologies, including an anthology that she had done when she was a faculty member at Rutgers. But in terms of pulling all of her things together singularly, this was her first attempt at it. One of the writers that Morrison turned to help her to sell Morrison's first book by an author and not a collection, because Morrison too had done a collection, Contemporary African Fiction, which was an anthology, was Lucille Clifton. Lucille Clifton was already a Random House author, but she was not on Toni Morrison's list. She had two other editors, in fact, before Morrison became her editor. Writer to writer, Morrison sent Clifton the galleys and asked if she would be willing to offer comments on Toni Cade Bambara's Gorilla My Love. Clifton agreed immediately, even though she had not yet begun to work with Morrison as her editor. Here's what Clifton says, one of my favorite lines from Lucille Clifton. And there are so many beautiful Lucille Clifton lines for us to learn, but there's one in particular you'll hear at the end. Clifton says about Gorilla My Love, "It is so good to be reading about real Black people who are doing what Black people really do, that is, dealing with life. She has captured it all, how we really talk, how we really are, and done it with both love and respect. I laughed until I cried. Then I laughed again. I loved it. She must love us very much." Bambara loved us indeed. After publishing another collection of short stories with Bambara, she began to consider Morrison's proposal to write a novel. Bambara wrote to Morrison that the title of another short collection she was working on, Salt, was trying its best to sprawl into a novel. Even if Bambara was reluctant to be so forthcoming with her editor, Bambara was completely comfortable confiding her uncertainty about the novel in its early stages with her friend, who was also a fellow writer. And I'm trying to make the distinction, even as there is not a neat, clean one between Morrison, the editor, and Morrison, the friend, who's also a writer. This is what Toni Cade Bambara writes to Morrison, quote, About this novel business, Miss Mim, how is it done? I now have 5 chapters, some 255 type pages, and I haven't a clue as to whether this is a novel or what. It's like I never saw one, much less read one in my whole life. Weird. There's this 77-year-old sassy woman who heals and stuff. She keeps dying every 30 pages or so. Perhaps you can have a talk with her and maybe explain that I'm new at this thing. So lighten up a little bit. I shall need some hard-headed directives. Those hard, end quote. Excuse me. Those hard-headed directives came in the form of intense editing sessions with Bombara coming to New York to work on the book as required. It was very hard to edit that book, meaning to make suggestions because she's so tight. Morrison confessed to Valerie Boyd about the book. Quote, you can't take anything out without the whole thing's collapsing. I used to complain a lot because I said she never waited for the lame and the halt, the reader. If they weren't with her, she just left them behind. End quote. The book needed the work of an editor who was also a friend. Morrison had just moved into her new home on the Hudson, and she invited Bombara to join her there for 3 days. And they went back and forth throughout the day with edits and revisions to ready the book for its publication. She'd write some and I'd edit some, quote, Morrison recalled. She would go upstairs and work, then she'd run down the stairs and say, well, what about this? Then I would sit down and go over that, and she'd run back up the stairs. It was the most amazing, but certainly extremely efficient thing for us, way to do it because she was so clear. She could focus immediately. And I'll pause here in the quote because Morrison would say, as she was telling this to me, she said she could focus in ways. She said, I'm looking out of the window and I'm thinking about all kinds of stuff instead of doing what I'm supposed to do. And I would tell Bombara something and she would fix it immediately and come right back down. By the time I began to like stew some peas, she was done. It's back to the quote. I would just grunt and point, and she knew exactly what I was suggesting. End quote. Excuse me. Morrison and Bombara remained close friends until Bombara's untimely death from colon cancer in 1993. A loss that stung Morrison at her core. Morrison, in fact, had invited Bombara to spend her last days to greet people in her apartment in New York. Morrison's early interaction with Clifton, as I have noted, was as a manuscript reader for Bombara. And her suspicion was that she would work well with Lucille Clifton was correct. Eventually, she had the opportunity. For the first 2 collections, Clifton published at Random House. Clifton had actually 3 white women editors. For years, Clifton had been interested in writing a story that would become Generations, the book you see in the upper right corner, which was centered on an ancestor named Caroline, who was first born, as far as Clifton's records indicate, in Dahomey, West Africa in 1822. Caroline's daughter, who was the first Lucille with 1 L, had purportedly been the first Black woman legally hanged in Virginia after allegedly killing her lover and father of her son. This woman was Clifton's great-grandmother. Clifton had signed a contract for the book in April 1969, and she and Morrison had talked about it when they first met in Morrison's office in New York. Clifton tried to explain the concept of the book to Alice Mayhew, her editor before Morrison. It'll take me months, she confessed to Mayhew. Quote, because the bringing of one's insides out, especially for somebody who has made a whole life carefully holding one's insides in, is some hard. Also, I think that after I bring them out, I shall have to trot them back in and hold them again. That's hard. I shall have to take me apart and put me back together, but I can do it if I just would, end quote. It took 5 years and a new editor for Clifton to accept her own challenge, the challenge of taking herself apart, putting herself back together. Part of the tension was also that she had experienced some backlash from her family members after she published an essay, The Magic Mama, in Red Book in November 1969. Her brother and her relatives were upset about the telling of the story that would become Generations, and this blocked her ability to write more about her family without feeling guilty. Clifton, though, appreciated having Morrison, another Black woman, as a sounding board for Generations. They talked at length by phone about the book, and Morrison's enthusiasm for it was immediate. The narrative was still sketchy in places, Morrison noted, but by and large, the core was a fascinating story. A few days after their lengthy conversation about the manuscript, Morrison wrote, quote, "Dear Lucille, Generations is so good. I do love it. What a good time I'm going to have publishing it," end quote. With Morrison on board, Clifton finished the book finally. Her enthusiasm made all the difference. Having someone that she could talk to who understood all of the different nuances of what it meant to tell a story about a Black woman who had a complicated relationship with a lover whom she kills and who is, again, allegedly the first Black woman who is hanged in the state of Virginia. The ease with which Morrison worked with Davis, Bambara, and Clifton was not true for all of her relationships with Black women writers, however. What started out as a wonderful relationship between Morrison and Barbara Chase Rabeau devolved over time. The first letter is celebratory. Morrison writes, "Dear Barbara, I astounded myself by getting some overwhelming support for your book at sales presentation yesterday. I went in hoping for a 1,500 print run, and well, I was brilliant. Now I have a very severe problem. How to get all those thousands of people to actually buy your book. If it comes back after we advance it, I will slit my throat." End quote. Here you see Morrison really grappling with the fact that it's a small run. She's Barbara Chase Rabeau is an unknown writer as a poet, though she does have a significant audience as a sculptor. Morrison shifts the print run from 1,500 to a larger print run just on a whim, and it ends up indeed failing. While Morrison had counted on Chase Rabeau's personality and her reputation as a sculptor to help sell the book, Chase Rabeau thought that the book would sell exclusively on its merits. Because Chase Rabeau was a sculptor and had an artistic audience, Morrison thought her charisma, her appeal, the fact that she had been on the cover of Ebony as a teenager, had been touted for all of her accolades as a sculptor, and her internationalism would work to her advantage. But Chase Rabeau said she wanted to avoid the fate of artists who, quote, tap dance for prizes and coverage, end quote. Of course, the racial undertone is there. Morrison had fought hard to get Random House to underwrite a book party. Let me see if the book party slide here. Because every book did not get a book party, but she imagined a beautiful event in a museum with her sculpture friends there, with the books on sale as well. So she was quite frustrated when Chase Rabeau was hesitant. Part of Chase Rabeau's anxiety, she ultimately admitted, was that her husband had disdain for self-promotion. And her husband is Mark Rabeau, a photographer. Quote, "Mark is pathologically against personal publicity," end quote. Chase Rabeau wrote to Morrison. "He thinks one should become famous like he did by sitting on a sand dune in the Sahara or in a rice paddy in North Vietnam," two of his most famous pictures. "So I'm fighting on two fronts. First, my own natural tendency to shy away and fuss about a whole thing, and Mark's," end quote. Chase Rabeau's husband, Mark Rabeau, was the celebrated French photojournalist, best known for photographing ordinary people doing ordinary things. Two of his most famous photographs were published in Life magazine. Hence, Barbara Chase Rabeau's comment that he thought that people should get famous sitting on a sand dune. Fortunately, Morrison and Chase Rabeau had gotten to know each other quickly during Morrison's visit with Chase Rabeau and Mark at the Rabeau's home in France one summer. Morrison and her boys went to Europe and stayed with Rabeau for almost 2 weeks. Their children played together in the day while Morrison and Chase Rabeau worked on the book, with plenty of shopping in between. The rapport they developed helped them withstand the many conflicts that arose as production of the book unfolded. Instead of tension, there was wit. And I think it's here that we see Morrison say, "Your insanity is so interesting, not at all like most madness. Let me give you some more purple peaks to fly from." To assuage Morrison or Chase Rabeau's fears about reading alone, Chase Rabeau said that her voice was too low and she was too timid and that her voice was too soft. Morrison agreed that she would read with her. Be assured that your editor will attend giving you moral support. And I'm not wholly turned off by the idea of reading with you. I do it well. If, however, by the time I am truly famous, as a consequence of my new book, Morrison was working on Sula, um, then you'll have to go ahead and get Miss Flack, as in Roberta. So go ahead and ask Lynn and hope that Roberta Flack is, oh, well, that she says Roberta because they're on a first name basis, apparently, is free. What happens here is Morrison had met Chase Rabeau through Lynn Nesbitt, agent, and they all know Roberta Flack. They're in these circles together. And Barbara Chase Rabeau is saying, I don't want to read. I don't want to go to this party. I don't want to do any of this. So she says, well, what if we get someone to read with you? And she asked Morrison, well, won't you read the poetry? And she says, well, let's put some music with it. And, well, maybe Roberta Flack would, do this party at Lynn Nesbitt's house, which is where they agree. They don't agree on the museum, but something more intimate at Lynn Nesbitt's. Morrison closed the letter with sentimentality and snark. Love, girl, and fuck the sand dunes. No doubt in response to Mark's sentiment about publicity and the way he left Chase Rabeau feeling unsure of herself, which Morrison really did find offensive. Morrison continued her support for her friend and continued to take shots at Mark. Will you want a dedication page? Morrison asked when it was time to work on the book's front matter. Sometimes both a dedication page and acknowledgement page is included. Quote, the latter being to Honeypot, without whose encouragement this book certainly got done anyway. That kind of thing. Or maybe thanks to. But that's kind of unusual at the end. Morrison's artful to honeypot dig, of course, was another dig at Mark. In Morrison's estimation, Mark seemed less enthusiastic about his wife's latest adventure. When Morrison sent Chase Rabeau the jacket proofs for the book, already high tensions between the two of them finally came to a head. Morrison chose a picture of Chase Rabeau holding a sculpture for the front of the book, and then a picture of Chase Rabeau for the back. The silver and black color scheme, along with the images, were meant to convey this aesthetic sense of elegance. But Chase Rabeau saw the choice differently. Quote, I find the dust jacket slick and over merchandise, and for no good reason, and to the detriment of the poems, Chase Rabeau wrote. I especially object in the strongest way to two photos back and front. The reaction here is negative in that it becomes, look, another Black book, which is not the case, or look, a Black girl. The whole feeling is vaguely sexist, Hollywood racist, and exploitive, and a bit of dialogue to get you out of the mentality of white publishing would have turned the tone into something good for both of us. Morrison's response at this point is measured and matter of fact. I don't understand you. Why did you send us 36 pictures if we weren't supposed to use them? 36 on the jacket or wherever. What did you think we were going to do with them? 7 calls, 2 telegrams have been placed with you to no response, but the urgency regarding publicity, not judgment about book covers. No author tells me what to do in that area. If you want an anonymous, plain, uneventful, recessive jacket, you should have never come to this publisher. The only time that works is when the poet is very well known as a poet. You are not. The purpose of the jacket is to make people pick it up, fondle it, and hopefully open the book. The asset text is on the pages. Remove the jacket and your book will die in every bookstore in this country. You have the opportunity to transfer. I want to show you just a little bit of it. Yeah, here's the handwritten note. And I'll say a little bit about that in just a second. You have the opportunity to transfer to some people some beauty and sensibility. Take a chance. And that's in those lines that I have bracketed here. And I'll pause here just to say, because it's handwritten and not typed, there's no way for me to authenticate whether or not this was actually sent. So she would typically write, her secretary would transcribe or type it, and then you'd see the typed copy. I only saw the handwritten copy, but I did talk to Chase Rabeau about it, and I showed her like an image of this, and she said she wouldn't be at all surprised by it because they were doing a lot of back and forth, and that They did end up having a tense relationship, so much so that they agree not to work together on the next book, which ends up being Sally Hemings, a tremendously successful book for Barbara Chase Robo. And interestingly enough, Morrison tells her, listen, this like long form diary for Sally Hemings' story is not going to work. You should try this as a novel, a straight historical novel. Chase Robo says no. And of course, it's Jacqueline Onassis who ends up publishing the book at Doubleday, following the instructions that Morrison had given her by and large. The tension between Morrison and Chase Robo was so thick at this point that Morrison ultimately asked Chase Rabeau whether or not Mark and his friends might have actually wanted the book to fail. Morrison didn't bother to respond to the insinuation that her imagination had been overtaken by white publishing, um, because she knew that she had learned to maneuver that world so quickly and so well. Her commitment to making the publishing industry bend toward her intentions as a Black writer and as an editor was beyond dispute. There's no neat way to talk about Morrison and her literary friendships. I'll stop my share here. The one commitment I've resolved to make as I tell stories about Morrison and the way that she interacted with other writers, about publishing, about censorship that happened internally and externally, is to follow some advice that Morrison gave me as we talked about how tricky book titles can be. I was proud of my academic concoction, The House That Toni Built at Random. She dismissed it with a quip. That's too long. Toni at random. Toni at random. Toni at random. We both repeated it. Toni at random. We agreed. It was okay to have a long title in your head to guide you, but to get the reader's attention, it needs to be short and sweet. As I think about Morrison's friendships with Black women writers, and I think about the legacy of Zora Hurston as it relates to Black women writers, as I think about censorship and publishing in the industry today, as I think about Morrison's friendship with Black women writers, the title is something in my head. The title that's in my head, which of course would be too long, is something like "Tell the Truth, Shame the Devil: Don't shy away from controversy. Avoid hero worship." But the best way to describe these friendships and Morrison's editorial legacy in a very difficult publishing world would be something like, "Dear reader, dear listener." It would be much simpler. It would just say Morrison's legacy should be something like love and stuff. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for that wonderful presentation, and felt like we were having a discussion and conversation. There were so many thoughts I was having. Now I'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Please feel free to post any questions in the chat box or raise your hand if you'd like to come off mute, and ask questions yourselves.
I see Jamil's hand. Jerica, am I floating or?
I can, excuse me, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Cater. I can vote for you.
Thanks, Jerica. Thank you so much for this great talk. I actually was very excited about it when I was reading the book too, because I just finished reading teaching Bambara's The Lesson. And I also taught Clifton's poem, Forgiving My Father. And when I read the connection between them, I was like, wow, that's really amazing. It's an incredible book and an incredible story, especially with the two Tonys. And Clifton in there was just incredible. Actually, I have to confess, like when you started talking about the death of Bambera, I felt like a tear coming down. It was really emotional for me for a second. I don't know why, but it felt like that. What interested me about the book and the discussion, especially the chapter on Bambara and the chapter on Angela Davis, is the way that Morrison was strategically negotiating wide structures of power. Uh, and I wasn't, I don't know I don't want to, sound like she was contradictory, but do you feel like she had made different sort of way, made different decisions based on different considerations that may look to us today like a little bit contradictory? I don't know if I'm expressing myself clearly here, but was she weaponizing the market against itself to expand circulation while also resisting white interpretive sovereignty? Or do you think that the institutional pathways inevitably reinscribe that sovereignty in subtle forms? And I'm thinking about the way that the one of the white male reviewers of Bambara's book was talking about the way that he was not offended because she was not shouting at him, but then later on he felt offended. And
I
that's my question.
Yeah, I appreciate all that's in there because the entanglements are apparent. Um, whether or not I would call them contradictory or not is still up for debate. In part because I think it is, and just because it's characteristically Morrison doesn't mean that it's not contradictory, to be clear. But I think she just muddied the same way that she muddies closure and clarity and definition in her fiction. I think she muddied her role as editor because indeed she was um, working in a white dominated industry. I think the dig by Barbara Chase Rabeau into saying like, have you like really been consumed by this white publishing world? Which I think was a function of Chase Rabeau's own struggle with moving away from Blackness and Morrison's leaning her into trying to get her to lean into Blackness. I think that forced the conversation about this is a commercial house. And if you are not interested in the commercial venture, you shouldn't have come here. That's the only time I see Morrison very explicitly saying, this is a commercial house, and this is what it is. Every other time in the inter-office memos, we see her saying, are we not like a house that's committed to literary artistry? For an advance of $500 and 1,500 copies, like we don't have anything to lose. Like it's like that moment in the Bombard and in the Chase Rabeau letter too. Take a chance. Like she's literally asking, like, you have this opportunity to convey some beauty. So I think it was both and. And I do think there were other instances where people were indeed questioning where her loyalty was. On the one hand, the Black Book is great, celebrates Black life, Black history, Black culture, um, makes the case that Black books will sell. And part of the reason that she says she does it is because she wants to end the conversation about not being able to sell books by Black authors or about Black life to Black and white people. So she's negotiating that tension. On the other side, there were Black people who said, we have some concerns about what taking this to a mainstream house means. Why not do this kind of book at an independent Black publisher? Which is also, I'll say really quickly, as I wrap up, why I thought it was really important to start the book with her panel on publishing at Howard, because that panel too tries to show how she's threading the needle of that contradiction or of that difficulty. She's saying, listen, the industry, like all of these things are stacked against us. Nobody's arguing against that, or nobody's arguing that publishers aren't there for us. The bookstores are few and far between. Salespeople don't want to go to our books, but what we have is ourselves. Like we all we got, and we're enough. So she puts the responsibility on the reader to say, demand this. And I think that ends up being the through line for her, that I will give the industry whatever Black readers demand. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Dr. Mathis.
Dr. Mathis?
Hi, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Oh my gosh, I so enjoyed your talk today about publishing, and it's so good to be sharing this virtual space. Now, I want you to know I have a question that I might have should have asked you on a sidebar, but here we are anyway.
Right.
So she talked about salt, the salt eaters, right? Because I'm guessing the original title was Salt at some point before it became the Salt Eaters.
Yep. As a short story, because it starts out as a short story called Salt.
Okay, that informs my question. So, part one, do you think it should have stayed a short story? Because I've only been able to get through the first chapter, and I imagine that that's the short story part. And two, I love that you dive into Morrison's difficulty with editing it because reading it is difficult. So I can't imagine what it was like as an editing project. And how do you feel about the Salt Eaters?
Now that I know what's happening in the Salt Eaters, because honestly, I didn't know what was happening in the Salt Eaters, and it's amazing what a graduate seminar will do for your like awareness, which is why I think being in a community like this to talk through ideas in books, so important, and also reading Bombara's description of what the story is, or the head note. I'll see if I can find it. But when she gives a description of it for the sales team about how to pitch the book and like to reviewers, she basically says, this is a story that takes place over the course of 15 minutes. But what's happening in Velma's mind is a series of flashbacks about all of the reasons why she is trying to figure out whether or not she wants to give up her mental stability. Because the novel opens, are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well? Like that's the question that Minnie is asking her. Basically saying, like, because being well is heavy. So are you
Yeah.
sure you want to be well? So if you think about it as, all right, so all I need to know is this is 15 minutes and Velma's trying to figure out whether or not she wants to be well. And she's thinking about all of the things that have her, that are keeping her from being well and how she's processing them and reading them as a series of kind of stories that go back and forth. Then it does become like, oh, that's what's happening here. It's like flashbacks. But what Morrison was clear about is that the novel was never Toni K. Bambara's form. Bambara
Mm.
was too fast of a writer, and as she says, like she's gonna leave the lame in the hall behind. Like she's going to move very quickly. But she was also very concerned, rightly so. And that goes back to, and I apologize, Jamil, I remember that, but not I don't want to like mistake people's titles, but I remember Jamil specifically. But it goes back to Jamil's empathy around Bambara's death. She did not have health insurance and very likely could have still been amongst us as like a beautiful cultural worker under other circumstances. So Morrison was clear about Bombara's need for resources and more exposure. And she says the industry is geared up for novels. Nobody buys short stories.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can't sell short story collections. You can't become, and it's not that she was trying to get her to become famous, but she wanted her to be able to earn enough money so she could quit doing 16 jobs. Now, granted, Toni K. Bambara was a culture worker, so she's going to do 16 jobs no matter what. But the big push for her for the novel is she knew as a writer, the novel was the thing that would get her attention.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not the Salt Eaters does everything that Bambara wants it to do, and a similar kind of challenge happens with Those Bones Are Not My Child. Bambara's final novel that Morrison essentially comes out of retirement to edit as as an editor. Anyway, she agrees to do it because they had started it many years prior. But she's a 10 plus short story writer and just a pretty good novelist. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
But
Thank
keep
you.
reading Salt Eaters. It works once you figure out what's going on. Yeah.
I listened to it on audiobook as I was going for a walk. And I was 2 hours into the walk. And I said, wait, who did what? Where? And now understanding it as maybe some fragments of memory and working through quite possibly mental unwellness in that moment
Yep.
maybe explains why it didn't make perfect logical sense.
Yep.
And so now that you've shared that, I can go back to it with different eyes and maybe slow down because I think I read it fast because it feels written quickly. And so, but thank you. Oh my God. Thank you so much.
Welcome. And Barbara was also interested in cinema at the time. So she's also trying to find, she's imagining imagine it as a filmed piece, like vignettes of film pieces. So
I have
Do
a
you have
question.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Someone else want to ask.
No, I was going to start questions from the chat, but go ahead, Mr. Peacock.
And I'm hoping I'm not showing my ignorance. When Toni Morrison died, I tried to buy almost everything that every book that she edited. And one book I discovered is The Case for Black Reparations.
Mhm.
And I wanted to find out if, in doing your research, you came across any like correspondence between the writer of that book and Toni Morrison. And then there's another question. Um, do you think, in what way or ways do you think it has a tie to the contemporary discussion about reparations, like by groups like ADOS?
Mhm.
Uh,
Good question. And I mean, I was completely fascinated by it, but few people ask me that question, so I'm excited to talk about it. Um, it's an interesting acquisition, if you will, for Morrison, because by and large, she had been doing literary texts at the time. She had done Huey P. Newton, and was interested in Angela. So she's doing these political um, autobiographies or essays, but except for Ivan Van Sertimer, they came before Columbus. Van Sertimer's at Rutgers, but she first comes upon Van Sertima because he has a novel that he wants her to read. And when the novel doesn't work out, she's like, well, like she would meet with her writers and they would have conversations. She's like, yeah, I want to tug on that thread of something that we were talking about over lunch. Like, tell me more about that. Like this novel thing, you might not be a novelist. So she had done that as an academic book. Boris Bidkers, or was interested in doing it because it comes out a little bit later. Boris Bidker was a law professor at Yale who had written in the style of the case for, like that's it's a law style, right? The case for this. This is why I'm making this case. James Foreman had gone to Riverside Church, interrupted, and said reparations now, like, and this is why. People were offended by it. Church communities, especially, like, how do you interrupt a church service? Foreman and the group of folks that he had been working with had been talking about reparations for Black people for many years. The critiques were all of Foreman's interruption. Nobody critiqued Foreman on the merits of the argument. So what Bitker says that he wants to do as a white law professor at Yale is, and I don't think it was that he meant offense to it. He said, I'm trying to take um, the idea out of a ghetto, and there he meant literally like the margin. I'm trying to take it out of the margin and bring it into mainstream conversation because I think that there is a legal case for this. Morrison then tries to figure out how she can sell this text or this academic argument as something that would be of popular appeal because she's really interested in getting people to think about reparations because I think that it's a genuine possibility that Black people can get reparations as early as the 70s. And of course, it's a conversation that had extended from much earlier on. I'm a lit professor, obviously, so I read and teach Belinda's petition, and Belinda actually does go to the courts and say, listen, I deserve money for my services, and she gets it. So there is a history of Black people getting reparations for stolen labor.
mm,
So Morrison is really thinking, like, what if we can move this to the mainstream to the point that we see some changes? Unrelatedly, but relatedly, Adam Clayton Powell has gone before Congress, has hearings to say we got to change textbooks. Now, that's an industry that she's in.
mhm.
And she's saying, if we can get people to change textbooks, and that's a whole lot of money. If Adam Clayton Powell can make that argument, we might be able to get this reparations argument going. And having this law professor do this is an interesting way of doing it. And so when she tries to move it from pure academic over into mainstream, she changes the title because he says something like a second American dilemma. He's talking about Gernard Murdahl. And she's like, no. Most people don't know that. We're going to say that I'm making the case for Black reparations. And he says in correspondence with her, wait a minute, I'm not making the case for it. I'm just saying, I'm not arguing for it. I'm just saying, here are all of the things that we need to consider if we're going to consider the case itself, not I'm making the case. And they actually get into like a little back and forth because she's like, this is going to be the title of this book, The End. So it becomes the title for the book, of course, and we don't see it in the mainstream in the same way again until Randall Robinson's The Debt, which does sell incredibly well. And does get people's attention, but still not in the same way that we see it with Ta-Nehisi Coates's The Case for Reparations in The Atlantic as an article, and then finally with the hearings that we see, but like slow burn had been happening with that like all along. And that argument is really about the legacy of enslavement. And it's while it does not make the case, it does not have the ADOS argument going, it does make the case on grounds of proof of discrimination.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. It was fascinating to me. I was like, everybody, like, why isn't everybody excited about this? You know, but it's not. The book itself isn't the most exciting read. But when it got reissued, they literally put on the front of the cover, and they reissued it not very long after the conversation became public again in the 2000s. And they had on the cover, edited by Toni Morrison, her comments about it from like the years prior, like from the editorial fact sheet.
I have a question from the chat from Allison Kursine, who says, I am, along with my father-in-law, who is also watching, curious about how much you drew from interviews and how much from documents, and to what degree there were discrepancies, and if there were, how did you deal with them?
Yeah. I'll try to be brief with this one since we're right up on time, but more documents, probably about 85% documents, 15% interviews. And even the 85% though is informed by the interview. So if I would talk to Ms. Morris about something and I couldn't figure it out or she didn't have an answer, then I would go and look for it. And then I'd go back and say, hey, I found this book that is in your editorial files and we didn't talk about this at all. And she, oh, I forgot about that. And then we talk about it. So it was some back and forth. But then there were instances where I'm like, this is in your editorial file. She's like, that wasn't my book. And I'm like, no, I got like 20 pages that say this is your book. She's like, that wasn't my book. I'm like, ma'am, this is your book. Like, or at least tell me why this isn't your book, because I see you signing off on it. And at that point, I remember like getting an email correspondence back. And I would joke, like, I thought that her assistant would always, like, she doesn't type a lot or didn't type a lot. And I was like, she might not, Renee is probably the person who's answering these emails, but one email that I got back said, not my book, 3 words. And I was like, okay. So the way that I reconciled it was I put a footnote in there to say, the archive suggests that Morrison worked with this writer. Consistently, she said this was not her book. And I never could understand why. And it wasn't like it was like a salacious book or it was something that like there was just no really good reason for her not to tell me, oh, I inherited that book from somebody. The only reason I was on the correspondence with it. And I just decided not to go down the rabbit hole anymore, just to footnote it and keep going. That honestly is the only real contradiction that I saw between, or that I couldn't completely reconcile. We were able to joke a little bit at one point about her saying in interviews that she, not with me, but in interviews that I had seen published, that she didn't particularly enjoy her time as an undergraduate. And so I'm like showing her pictures like smiling Chloe Wooford, smiling Chloe Wooford. Oh, you look pretty happy here. You know, like what's happening? Like, I see you as, a football sweetheart. I thought, you thought that there was like the superficiality and like no merit and color being an issue. And she's like, well, I didn't ever say I didn't have a good time.
Thank you. And if you wouldn't mind, I know we're close on time. Well, we're over time, but there's one more question from the chat if you wouldn't mind addressing. Um, Dr. Brandy McLeese says, this was amazing. You have probably changed the theme for one of my upcoming courses. I wasn't aware of Morrison's relationship with Lucille Clifton, and I find that so intriguing. Were there other strong relationships or friendships that Morrison cultivated with other Black women authors through her position as an editor?
Yes. By far, Bambara was the strongest. She had the shortest relationship, similarly tense, with June Jordan. Gail Jones would probably be the one that I would say it was a very strong relationship that she cultivated. They weren't friends because their ages were so different, but by and large, Morrison was very protective of Gail Jones, especially through Corregidora, Eva's Man, and White Rat. So much so that and goes back to Dr. Kadir's question about the contradictions. On the one hand, early on, she told Gail Jones, listen, you don't need an editor. I mean, you don't need an agent. An agent's just going to take 15% of your money, and I am going to negotiate on your behalf. So keep your money. By the end, she tells Gail Jones, girl, you should get an editor. They're not giving you as much money as you should have. So, and here's the editor that you should get, because this is an editor who is going to come in like gangbusters for you. So Jones, as we know, is very fragile, very tentative about social engagements and interactions. So Morrison is her advocate until she marries, and her husband, after Morrison has edited 3 of Gail Jones's books, insists that Morrison send to him a sample of her work as an editor, at which point Morrison says, I'm done. Gail Jones is one of 3 interviews with the other. Everybody else who was living, I got interviews from. I didn't get Gail Jones, and I'm still hustling. If anybody knows how I can get to Gail Jones, tell me. Even as this book is over, that's still one that I would like. That's a thread I would pick up on. And people ask me, like, what's next? Are you doing that? And I'm like, I'm done with it, kind of. Wesley Brown, I didn't get to talk to, but I now have contact information for. And then Nettie Jones, same thing. Have contact information for Nettie Jones, but everybody else I was able to interview. And to some degree, that was like a benefit, if you can say such a thing, of COVID. Like, it was easy to email people, have them email you back, and set up Zoom interviews. I would not have been able to go to 20 plus archives, but I could write to the folks at Emory to say, my plan was to come to the Lucille Clifton collection. I'm looking for this correspondence specifically. Would you send me what you have? And they would send it to me. That happened at so many different places where people were incredibly generous, so that I was able to begin to understand the complexities of those strong relationships and friendships that she might have alluded to and that I might have read about somewhere else, but I just wasn't able to get to. But the Gail Jones chapter is one that I think, if I were to look specifically at, to have you like go straight to another one of those strong relationships that she cultivated over the course of the years. I feel like I'm forgetting somebody, but I'm always forgetting somebody.
Thank you. And I was mistaken. We do have a bit more time. Our session ends at 12:30. So if
Okay.
you're okay, I've got a couple more questions
All
I'll get to. Um, I won't complain about having more time. I
right.
agree with Leah. She says she could listen to this all day. Um, Ms. Corliss asks, oh, where did it go? Let me scroll up a bit. Apologies.
No problem.
She says, oh, your book highlights how Toni Morrison's literary friendships helped shape her own creative life. For students today who are just beginning to build their own academic or creative communities, um, where did it go? Oh, academic or creative communities. What lessons can they take from Morrison's literary friendships about supporting each other's growth and creativity?
I think it's really important for writers, scholars, and I would say students, but also people who are just in academic communities, literary communities in a general sense, to find your community and to rely on each other and support each other. I don't talk about it as much here, but there are plenty of places where we see documentation of people taking care of each other. It's essentially like mutual aid. As a matter of fact, the way that Toni Morrison comes up on Henry Dumas's work is she's babysitting for Quincy Troop. Or I'm sorry, let me reverse. Quincy Troop is babysitting for her. So they would take care of each other's kids. They would all agree like who's bringing food, or they would do meal share at the top of the week, Sunday, and make sure that like everybody was taken care of. It really was mutual aid on the practical side. So it's important to have friends who can take care of your practical needs, but also your intellectual needs, and that you can share in that way. So part of what I would say is it's so much easier to do the work in community than it is to do it alone. The isolation that we experience as academics that we've been trained into, like you sit somewhere, you read, you write by yourself. I hope that we can resist some of that impulse and try to be in community together and to build, because it does facilitate generative and generate creative support or creative ideas. Because ideas that Morrison had from her work as an editor, especially with a Black book, for instance, show up in her own writing. Sula is informed by, I think, some of the work that she was doing as an editor. Of course, Beloved comes from the clip that she reads in the Black book on Margaret Garner. When she's editing a cookbook, we begin to see her understand how to write recipes in text. And so as she thinks about, like, we see representations of food consumption, like, I think those relationships are just so fruitful.
Thank you. I'll ask a question of my own now. Listening to you speak, and uh, Toni seemed like she was so particular and adamant about of what she wanted when it came to her approach to editing, and what she would do and what she wouldn't do. How did you find a balance as you were going through this process of putting this book together, a balance of what you wanted versus what she may have wanted?
That was hard. And so it took me a very long time. I started thinking about this book as a graduate student. I was the typical graduate student when it came to like the dissertation. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I had the good fortune of like my mentor with whom I'm still very close and who I am very clear is facilitated the relationship between me and Ms. Morrison. They were very close friends. And we were in this grad seminar. By and large, I thought like I was going to do like Black women playwrights. That's what I did my master's work on. Like I was set, I had a plan. And I get in this grad seminar on contemporary African American narratives. And I'm enjoying these books. We did Gail Jones, we did Toni K. Bambara, we did Leon Forrest, Henry Dumas, John McCluskey, and I'm forgetting somebody. Did I say Bambara? I think in any event, I asked Dr. Traylor, I said, "Oh, I'm really enjoying these books, but like you had like hundreds of books to choose from. Why these?" And she casually said, "Oh, those are the books that Toni edited when she was at Random House." And I was like, "What do you mean? Like, who are we talking about? Who is Toni?" And she's Toni Morrison. And I was like, "Toni Morrison was an editor?" And she said, "Yes." And I was like, "And at Random House?" And she said, "Yes." So I said, "Hmm." And she said something to the effect of, "Yeah, there's a project there. Like obviously you're gonna have to do a final paper, so you should think about it." I appreciated her generosity of just like essentially handing me a project. Like here's something that you can pursue, because I didn't experience this at all at Howard, but we hear of people in graduate programs elsewhere where there's so much competition for ideas. And it's usually the opposite, where a student comes up with a great idea and the faculty member is like, "All right, let me pursue this." It was the complete opposite. She's like, here's an idea, take it. I can't do everything. Like, okay. So I thought that I could do it. Eventually, the more I read, the more excited I was. And I thought that I would do it as a dissertation project. This is a long way of answering your question. So I get to write my proposal, and Dr. Traylor says, "No, that's too big of a project for a dissertation. You should pick one of the writers and just like get on about your business." And I was like, "No, I'm going to show her." And then like 6 months later, I was like, "No, she was right. It's too big of a project." So it started out as a project that was going to be about the fiction Toni Morrison edited at Random House and putting her in conversation. And the central idea was really simple. The Norton Anthology of African American Literature lists every period as a period. When you get to literature of after 1970, that's just what it's called. So I was like, okay, I'm going to name a period, because that's what we teach people to do as graduate students, right? Like name a thing. So I'm going to name this period, and I'm going to use these writers that Morrison edited in her fiction as my periodization contribution to the field. That's the plan for the project. 10 years out, it wasn't even that long, probably because I was at Northwestern at the time. Morrison had given the Leon Forrest lecture at Northwestern a year after he had made his transition. And I went to the lecture because I was a Ford Fellow at Northwestern at the time. We talk, and she's looking at me like, why do you know this much about Leon Forrest? We're in a room with a whole bunch of people who work with Leon Forrest who don't really know Leon Forrest. And I was like, oh, I was in this class with Dr. Traylor, and we did these books that you edited. And she said, oh, that was such hard work, and nobody talks about it. If you ever decide to do something with that project, let me know. I'll be happy to help. At that point, you just like put your foot on the gas. You go, okay, Toni Morrison's gonna help me do something. Let's go. So I literally went back to where like let me figure out like how like what a train ticket like where how do I do it how do like what do I like how do I do this like tomorrow and we talk and we're talking about the fact that I want this book to be about like the period after 1970 in African American fiction. First interview, hour and a half, and she talks about everything except for the fiction. And I'm like, man, this lady's playing games with me. Next interview, talk about like a little bit of the fiction, not. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna send her the questions in advance because I want her to talk about this fiction. Long story short, I didn't realize it at the time. I don't know if she was doing it intentionally, but I think the project was getting edited as we were talking. Because, like, however many times later, I was like, I think this book might be about the editorship and not about the fiction. And I think she was kind of like, it took you long enough to get there. I appreciated the fact that she didn't impose it, but she imposed it in a different way in the sense that she just didn't talk about what I wanted to talk about. It was this story is bigger than what you were thinking. So I had to strike the balance between what I thought the project was and what I wanted it to be versus what she saw the project was in terms of its potential. And obviously, one is a very academic book and one is a no, that was hard work and somebody needs to talk about like what it meant to be an editor in a mainstream publishing house. So then I had for the next however many years to learn the industry and to learn what it meant because admittedly I imagine like I knew that I didn't know a lot of Black editors, but I didn't know editors, period. So I didn't even know that there weren't that many. So as I began to think about it, and I was always attracted to literary history, the more I began to think about it, I accepted the fact that the project could be bigger. So finding a way to balance what I thought it was versus what she was inviting me into was kind of easy. The bigger challenge came with how am I going to do all of this in this number of pages? I think I had to cut, it was at least 10,000 words. So a lot of pages, like trying to figure out, that was the harder thing. Like what story am I not going to tell? Because I think all of them are really important.
Wow, thank you so much. That what a beautiful experience. I got goosebumps a little bit. This time we are unfortunately out of time. But thank you again so much for speaking with us. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to the conference organizers, and it was lovely talking with you.
Thank you. And thank you all so much. Appreciate it. Good to see you. Bye-bye. Thank you.